Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's such an incredible privilege to be able to speak to you here today, and it just blows me away that you've taken an interest in me, in my writing, and more importantly, in history. So, why are we here today? Well, of course, part of the reason is to celebrate the release of Alfred the Great. But I wanted today to be a bit more than that. Over the past few months, I've often been asked what inspired me to write this book. And in one sense, there could be a very long answer to that question, because in one way, my entire life went into the story. But in a more specific way, it was Alfred the Great that inspired this book. Well, who was Alfred the Great? Alfred the Great, I'm going to call him King Alfred from now on, because Alfred the Great gets a bit long to keep saying. King Alfred was an absolutely amazing man. After all, he was the only English monarch, so far anyway, to be called great. But although he was great, King Alfred was actually a very ordinary person who knew what it was like to struggle with personal weakness and even with failure. I mean, he was a terrible cook. Sorry, if you don't know the story of Alfred and the burnt cakes, don't worry, I will be explaining that later, but I couldn't resist. Anyway, in all seriousness, he was a man well acquainted with weakness and obstacles. And yet, God used him to literally change English history and ultimately Western history. So today, I'd like to tell you a bit about how Alfred's legacy still impacts us today. And also on a more personal level, I'd like to show you how his story can be a blessing in both your life and mine. Alfred was born in 849, yes, over 1,000 years ago. As a child, he had a very sharp mind and he loved to learn. There's this lovely story about how his mother, when he was quite young, ran a competition for her sons. She said that the first son to memorize an entire book of poems that she had would get the book as a prize. Now, in those days, books were a lot more valuable than they are now. They were handwritten, often embellished with beautiful artwork, gold leaf, jewels. So this was quite a special prize. Well, you can guess who won the prize. It was her youngest son, Alfred, of course. Yes, Alfred was the youngest son. Actually, he was the fifth son in his family. Now, if you know much about how inheriting a throne works, you know that he didn't stand much of a chance to become king. But those days were so rough that by the time Alfred was in his 20s, his father and all of his four older brothers had either died of disease or had been killed in battle. So it was that Alfred found himself stepping into the throne at the young age of 22. Younger than me. Now, the throne he ascended wasn't a particularly comfortable one. Let me take a moment to set the scene for you. For decades, England had been invaded by Vikings. Vikings, by the way, came from various different Scandinavian countries, but the ones that troubled Alfred the most were the Danes from Denmark. At that time, England was divided up into smaller kingdoms. You can see that on the map inside your brochure that I gave you. Alfred was the king of Wessex. But Wessex had some problems. For one, at this point, it was the only kingdom that hadn't actually been conquered by the Danes. By the time Alfred became king, most of those other areas were under the control of the Danes. But Wessex itself had some internal problems. For one thing, they didn't really have an army. The way the system worked at that time was the kingdom was divided up into shires, which were then split up into smaller groups called feuds. So the way it would work is that the king would summon his aldermen, who would then call out the Danes, who would then get the feuds together. And then they would all go together and form a big army to fight whatever battle needed to be fought. But these feuds were made up of ordinary craftsmen, farmers, just people living their normal lives in their villages. And so when the Danes invaded or there was some need for battle, these people would just have to up and leave everything that they had, their homes, their farms, whatever, quickly go fight the battle, and then as soon as the battle was over, they rushed back to look after their homes. So you can imagine how the king would have a bit of trouble maintaining an army, because as soon as the battle was fought, lost or won, whatever the case, his soldiers would quickly go rushing all home again. And you can imagine what it would have been like for the people, living at that time, how after decades and decades of raids, you can imagine how unstable life must have been, very, very uncertain. Which leads to another problem that Wessex had, and which kind of flowed out of this, was because of the state of the kingdom, there wasn't much time for unnecessary things like learning to read and write. They were focused on survival. By the time Alfred became king, most of his subjects, including the upper class and the clergy, were totally illiterate. So yeah, even without the threat of the Danes, Alfred had some pretty big problems on his hands. His kingdom was literally crumbling from the inside out. Then add the Danes into the mix. The Danes deliberately targeted monasteries. And monasteries at that time were the centres of education. Because monks really valued the Bible, they really valued the written word in general, and they not only preserved copies of the Bible, but also other works of philosophy, history, theology. But of course the Danes would sweep through and destroy these places. And so not only were people uneducated, but the means of getting an education were rather restricted. So you might be wondering why the Danes targeted monasteries specifically. One reason, of course, is that they housed many treasures, lots of gold and jewels, and of course the Danes wanted that. And another reason, I think it's a combination of both, is that they seem to have had quite a deep hatred for all things Christian. It was Christianity directly opposed their belief system, their religion, and some stories show how much they despised it. I mean, they would specifically do things to try to shock Christians. So, for example, they would kill the monks on the church altars and things like that, specifically to desecrate the holy places. As you can begin to tell, the Danes were not really the sort of enemy one can mess around with. They were incredibly skilled, fearless, determined warriors. Their skill in warfare surpassed that of the Saxons. I mean, after all, they had conquered most of England by this point. They were also excellent sailors and navigators. They made these beautiful longships that were designed in such a way that they could sail in really shallow water, which meant that the Danes could go right up the rivers and get right into the heart of the territories they were attacking. Alfred did have a navy, but it wasn't the greatest. The technology wasn't as advanced as the Danes, and he didn't have anywhere near as big a fleet. The Danes were not only extremely skilled and resourceful, but they were very cruel. One story that gives us a bit of an idea of what they were like is the story of King Alfred. He was the king of Northumbria, and in 866 he was defeated by the Danes. they captured him and actually sacrificed him to their god Woden through an indescribably cruel and torturous ritual called the Blood Eagle. As you can tell, Alfred's position as the king of the last kingdom to be holding out against these relentless Danes was by no means a comfortable one. And think of the pressure on him. What would have happened if Wessex had fallen? Well, the whole of England would have been under the control of the Danes. So you can imagine how the weight on this young king's shoulders. Well, Alfred was crowned king close to Easter in 871, after the death of his brother who had been wounded in battle. Not long before he was crowned, King Alfred had already had an opportunity to show some of his leadership and military skills in the Battle of Ashdown. In this battle, he led the Saxons in an incredibly successful victory against the Danes. But unfortunately, this battle was followed by many sad defeats. For the first few years of his reign, Alfred was focused mainly on keeping the Danes at bay. While the fighting force available to him got weaker and smaller, the Danes kept getting reinforcements from overseas. In 877, things got particularly desperate. And not to give too much away, but this period is basically the era where my story starts. So, in 877, a Danish king by the name of Guthrum, who had already been trying to take Wessex for a while, began to close in with his army. Desperately, Alfred tried to buy time, offering him money and gifts in exchange for peace. But Guthrum would not negotiate. He took the town of Exeter on the southern coast of Wessex and set up a base there from which he could continue an ongoing campaign against Wessex. You see, he was expecting to be joined by a massive army that was sailing towards Wessex in a fleet of over 100 ships. This fleet was much too large for King Alfred's army to fight, and if that host of warriors landed, Wessex would be pretty much lost. But just as the fleet was about to land on England's shores, a miracle took place. A terrible storm struck the fleet, destroying about 120 of the ships, costing the Danes around 3,000 men. And the standards of those days, that was a significant loss. When the news of that disaster reached Guthrum, he changed his mind about negotiating with King Alfred. The kings exchanged vows of peace, and Guthrum withdrew with his army to Mercia, a kingdom on the northern border of Wessex. This actually wasn't the first time Guthrum had negotiated with Alfred. Before, they had exchanged hostages, they had made vows, and Guthrum had simply gone away, killed the hostages, and come back. So that hadn't worked too well. So this time, Alfred tried to make Guthrum make the treaty based on an oath that Alfred thought would be more binding for Guthrum. He made Guthrum swear by the ring of Thor, a holy symbol in the Viking religion. Well, the coming months would show that Guthrum didn't seem to think much of any vows, no matter what they were made by. The 6th of January was actually the last day of Christmas in the medieval calendar. On that day, the 6th of January, 878, King Alfred was in the fortified town of Chippenham, celebrating the height of the joyous festival. And it was on this night that Guthrum decided to renew his campaign, right in the middle of winter. The Danish army descended on Chippenham totally unexpectedly, taking it by surprise. With only a small force of warriors, Alfred had no way of defending the city and literally had to flee for his life. Now let's pause for a minute to imagine what this would have been like for young King Alfred. By this point, he was about 30 years old. He'd been married for nearly 10 years. He would have had children. He must have just begun to settle down and enjoy the peace that his treaty seemed to have procured. Perhaps his aldermen were congratulating him on his successful bargain with Guthrum. But now suddenly, he's found himself running like a coward. He may have hoped that the aldermen in the surrounding areas would have helped him to muster an army, but one by one these men just surrendered to Guthrum. So Alfred literally had no means of fighting back. This season is perhaps the most famous part of Alfred's story, and it's from this time that we get the story of the burnt cakes. So, the way the story goes is that while Alfred was hiding in the marshes of Athelney, he stayed for a little while with a peasant and his wife. He was in disguise at this point, so they didn't know who he was. Well, one day, the peasant's wife had to go and do something, I don't know, and she asked Alfred to look after her cakes. These would have been more like flatbreads that would have been baked by the fire. Well, of course, Alfred agreed, but he was a little bit preoccupied with other worries, as you can imagine. And he forgot about the cakes, and they got burned. And when the peasant's wife got back, she was so furious, and she gave him a really sound scolding. Of course, not knowing that she was scolding her king. And that's the story that is in all the history books about King Alfred. And I guess it's a pretty cool story, but he did a lot more wonderful things than burning cakes. As eventful as it might have been, this was probably one of the most difficult periods of Alfred's life, as you can imagine. But I'd like to take a moment to read to you what his biographer and close companion later wrote about this. His friend Bishop Asser said, "The Almighty not only granted to this same glorious king, King Alfred, victories over his enemies, but also permitted him to be harassed by them, to be sunk down by adversities, and depressed by the lower state of his followers, to the end that he might learn that there is one Lord of all things, to whom every knee doth bow, and in whose hand are hearts of kings, who puts down the mighty from their seats and exalteth the humble." Isn't it incredible that Asser saw how God was using this time of trial and suffering to prepare Alfred for his future reign? And Alfred was not defeated yet. Secretly, he began to muster an army. Perhaps his people were fed up with the days by this point. Perhaps the approach of spring gave them new courage. But whatever the case, people flocked, albeit quite secretly, to their king. They gathered at a place called Egbertstone in Selwood Forest. About 7 weeks after Easter, and this is quite ironic because Guthrum attacked at Christmas and Alfred is now renewing his attack just after Easter. 7 weeks after Easter, King Alfred marched out of Selwood Forest with quite a formidable army. King Guthrum had news of Alfred's movements by this point and was already on his way to meet him. But he was not prepared for the force that Alfred had managed to muster. The armies met at a field near to the town of Edington. It was a long, gruesome battle. Now, this battle is one of the central historical events that my story is built around, but I do not, because of the nature of the story, I don't describe the battle in detail. If you like that sort of thing and want a really good, clear description of what it would have been like, I highly recommend the book The White Horse King. It has a lot of details in it about King, other stuff about King. Absolutely amazing resource. I've got an example of it on a table over there. Anyway, the way battles were fought at that time was they would use a system called the shield wall. So what they would do is the men in the front line would hold up their shields, slightly overlap them, to form a wall. And both armies would do this, and the aim of the battle would basically be to break through that wall. So if you were in the battle, you can imagine if you're the man in the second row, if someone falls in front of you, you quickly step up and put your shield in their space to quickly fill that space so that the shield wall isn't broken. You can imagine how if the armies were, that if one army outnumbered another, it would be pretty easy for the one with more people to defeat the one with less. But in this case, the armies were pretty evenly matched. So the battle started in the morning and it went on for hours and hours and hours. The Saxons by this point would have been getting very exhausted. But they were fighting for their homes, their families, and yes, even their faith. They knew that if they lost this battle, all of Wessex would be Guthrum's, or the Vikings belonged to the Vikings, the Danes in general, and all of England would be under the control of these anti-Christian people. Well, at last, late in the afternoon, the shield wall broke. The Danes fled back to Chippenham. The Saxons pursued them all the way. Guthrum actually managed to garrison Chippenham, and he stayed there. He was able to keep the Saxons out for 2 weeks. Alfred besieged Chippenham, and after 2 weeks, the threat of starvation became too severe, and Guthrum surrendered. Chippenham hadn't been prepared for a siege. So now, Alfred has this terrible king in his power. And this is an amazing part of his story. Remember how many times he had negotiated with Guthrum, and Guthrum had broken his vows. Alfred had paid him large sums of money. Guthrum had just taken it and come back. The amount of lives lost because of Guthrum's ambition, and also what Alfred himself, think of what Alfred himself had suffered because of this man. And now he has this man in his power. And what does he do? He offers him mercy. Not only does he offer him mercy, but he agrees to allow him to continue to be the king of the kingdom of Wessex, Mercia. But he had a condition, and this is quite an interesting and a bit of a controversial condition. He asked that Guthrum become Christian. Now, as a Christian myself, I do not believe that it's ever biblical to force anybody into Christianity. But I also know that we don't fully understand what was going on at that time. Our records are very limited. We don't know what passed between the kings. We don't know what kind of training Guthrum would have first had to undergo. We just don't know. But whatever the case, Guthrum agreed to these terms, and he was baptized at a little church in Alla, a very insignificant village that I featured in my story. He was baptized there and then returned to Mercia. Actually, Alfred was his godfather in the baptism, and Guthrum was given a new Christian name, the name Athelstan. Did Guthrum actually become Christian? Well, we can't really know for sure. But one thing we do know is that he never attacked Wessex again. The historical records after this point also, they use his Christian name. He had coins made, archaeologists have actually found these, with his Christian name Athelstan on them. And a few months after his baptism, a new army of Danes landed near Wessex and asked Guthrum for help to try and take Wessex again. And Guthrum actually refused. So considering his behaviour beforehand, I think this is pretty telling, but yeah, we don't know for sure. It would make this talk, after the victory of Edington, Wessex was mostly at peace for the rest of Alfred's reign. There were a few more battles, actually towards the end of his reign, the Danes seemed to renew their attacks quite a bit more again. But yeah, they were only really conquered by his grandson. But for the most part, Alfred had time to turn his attention to rebuilding his kingdom. Remember how many weaknesses it had: no army, total lack of education, and he started to try and remedy these problems. Now, it would make this talk way too long if I were to explain everything that Alfred did. But to give you some idea of the impact he had, I'll list a few of the biggest things quickly here. He established a military system which meant that Wessex had a defence force that was permanently available. He came up with this brilliant system that meant that basically half of the able men were working on their farms and half of them were ready to fight within the country if need be. He also strengthened the navy, having more ships built, and I think with better designs as well. And he re-established the law code and a system of justice. You can imagine with all the chaos in the kingdom, that sort of thing had kind of gone a bit out of the window. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. He was, and very importantly, he began a campaign to re-educate his people. He was about as strategic with this as he had been in setting up the defence force. He made it a rule that all of the leading men in the kingdom must learn to read. He also started a translation program, bringing in scholars from Europe to England to help translate important books into Old English. So now we call the language of the Anglo-Saxons English, but it's very different to our modern English. That's changed a lot since then. So that's why we call it Old English. At that time, most books of education and also the Bible were in Latin. And so Alfred realized he had people that could barely read English, their own language, and then to get an education to read the Bible, they would then have to learn Latin. And so that's why he began these translation programs. He actually translated several books himself, including, many scholars believe, the first 50 Psalms. By the reign of Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, yes, he's had the same name as Guthrum, I'm not sure why. By the reign of Athelstan, Wessex had become such a centre of learning that kings from Europe actually sent their sons to be trained in the Saxon court. This is only a couple generations later. What an amazing change. So, what does all this mean for us in 2023? Well, first of all, when we look at the big picture of the Western world as we know it today, we see that we actually owe a lot to King Alfred. What would England have looked like if the Danes had taken over? Well, we don't know. But one thing I can guarantee is that without the foundation that Alfred laid, the United Kingdom would not have become the nation it did. And now think about this. What would America and Australia have looked like if the history of the UK had been different? Perhaps you can start to see how big Alfred's influence on history was. But it goes a bit deeper than this. I mean, history might have been different, but does it really matter anyway? Think about the foundation on which Alfred built. His law code was based on the Bible. Believe me, it reads almost exactly like certain parts of Exodus. It starts with a slightly adjusted version of the Ten Commandments. This system became the foundation foundation for the common law, what we call the common law. A system of justice that is still used today in the US, Australia, UK, and other places that were colonized by the UK, including Pakistan and India. I'm sure that with the introduction of these new laws, Alfred's people some of them might have resented it, right? They might have been like, oh, maybe they would have preferred the freedom to do whatever they like. I think there were several of the leading men who did not think that it was necessary to learn the religion. But what Alfred was actually doing was he was setting his people free. And he was able to do this because he was basing his laws and decisions on the Bible, which ultimately is the only manual for true freedom. He began to show the world, the Western world, what true freedom looks like. It was also Alfred's biblical worldview that gave him a passion for re-educating his people. He knew that his kingdom had fallen into the condition it had because they had neglected to build on the work of their Christian forefathers. The state of the kingdom hadn't always been as bad as it was when Alfred became king. Alfred explains this at length in his preface to Pastoral Care, one of the books he translated. I've got some copies of that on the table, or a modern English translation of it. You're welcome to take one if you like. So in the preface to Pastoral Care, he says, "We have now lost both the wealth and the wisdom of our predecessors because we would not bend down to their tracks with our minds." He goes on to explain his goal of correcting this problem by translating good books into English. Again, we don't really have a whole lot of time to go into this, but the books that Alfred translated generally promoted values that were countercultural to the average Anglo-Saxon. For example, the Saxons highly valued fame and personal glory, especially the kind of glory that comes from doing great deeds in battle. Their literature, Old English literature, really shows this. The works that Alfred translated often promoted the opposite, a more Christian value of humility and self-sacrifice and humble service. And what's so interesting is that when you study Old English literature, you see that after Alfred, the content of the literature actually began to change, with much fewer pieces being written about, fame and battle and all of that, and more on other themes. You can begin to see how his work actually began to set the course of Western culture, ultimately Bible-based, because it was Bible-based. So that's the big reason for Alfred's impact on us today. But now, as I bring this to a close, I'd like to bring it right down to a more personal level. King Alfred's story has helped me a lot in my own personal life, and I believe it can help and encourage you too. As you can tell, Alfred was a pretty amazing man. But as we have seen, he certainly had his trials. And I haven't even told you all of it. He was actually a very sick person. For most of his life, he struggled with a strange and serious disease. Often he would be in so much pain, he was totally debilitated, he couldn't do anything. The pain would grip him unexpectedly, and there were times when he had to be practically carried from his banqueting hall. He was only 50 when he died. So Alfred the Great was really a very weak man, but God used him to save a nation. Isn't that typical of the way God works? I think of the many, many examples throughout the Bible of how God used weakness to show his strength. It reminds me of that verse that says, Christ's strength is made perfect in weakness. And also of 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27, which says that God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Of course, the greatest example of God working through weakness is how he himself took on the weakness of humanity and died on the cross, paying the debt we owed him, defeating sin, death, and providing freedom and joy for all those who trust him. This paradoxical strength through weakness theme is one that I've explored in depth in Among the Great, and is really at the heart of my passion behind this story. So today, I'd like to bring you some encouragement. No matter where you are, no matter what you're facing, you might right now be in a place of feeling defeated or incapable or ineffective. If you are leaning on Christ for his strength, he can and will work through you. And you might not even see the fruits of what he does. I'm sure King Alfred could never have imagined the impact that his humble efforts to serve and save his tiny little kingdom would affect the entire world. But never, ever underestimate the power of a life lived in faithful service to Christ. So I would like to end with a quote from Among the Great. Edith, one of the central characters, is talking to some nuns. She's trying to convince them that her brother is the only one who can really save their village and lead them into battle, because he has noble blood and greatness runs in his veins. At one point in the conversation, one of the nuns looks at her and says to her, "Child, the greatest heroes are often the most ordinary people." I'll leave you with that.